Episode 5, The March to Mexico. Last time, in Episode 4, Cortes began construction on the town of Villarrica, found new allies in the Totonacs, and dealt with competing Spaniards, while establishing the bureaucracy to manage his power. In Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma and the Triple Alliance leaders agree to the inevitable meeting with Cortes. The smell of iron in the blood, it's unique. It sticks out like a cool metallic flavor that lands on the palate somewhere between scent and taste. The strange sensation enters the nose as aerosolized blood hits the taste receptors. It stands apart from the more earthly smells of the blood. The priest of Huitzilopochtli had severed a sacrifice's heart and brought it inside the house at the top of the Templo Mayor. Blood from the organ was spattered on the walls, and the organ left in a stone receptacle near the colorfully decorated statue of Huitzilopochtli. Moctezuma had ordered a sacrifice to seek answers and reassurance. He had many questions since these men arrived, and now, as he stood at the center of the continent's greatest city, upon his people's greatest temple, Moctezuma did not feel secure. There had been signs, and the seers had foretold of fire and destruction. Lightning had struck the Templo Mayor several years back, a bad sign, the priests had said. And now these strange men arrive and lay waste to surrounding communities. By August of 1519, it was clear to Moctezuma that Cortes was coming to Tenochtitlan. Wherever Cortes had gone, destruction and death to his opponents had come with him. The coastal Maya to their south had been gutted, their gods toppled, and the priests left caring for statues of a woman and a bloodied man nailed to a cross. The Totonacs were now in open rebellion against Moctezuma and supporting the Spanish logistically and militarily. In Cortes's urgency to meet, it was as if every gift of gold was seen as an invitation rather than a payment to depart. Moctezuma had sent his best negotiators. He sacrificed men for answers, but the gods had none. He told Cortes to leave. He offered to pay tribute, and he had sent magicians to leave curses and venomous snakes for the Spanish, none of which worked. In fact, Moctezuma had tried everything but using his massive military force to crush these few invaders. Finally, he sent his nephews to their new town of Villarrica to invite them to his capital for the meeting Cortes so badly desired. Part 1. Departing Cempoala. August 16th, 1519, Cortes would later record in his second letter to King Charles V, was the day they departed Cempoala for Tenochtitlan. Cortes set out on the road toward Tenochtitlan with 400 Spaniards, 15 horses, 200 Totonac tamimes, 40 war chiefs, and perhaps as many as 2,000 Totonac warriors. In the new town of Villarrica de la Veracruz, he left 150 men to continue building and to defend their supplies and accumulated gold. With scouts riding ahead, the group set out into the lush, green foothills of the Sierra Madre toward the village of Xalapa, 2 days' march from Cempoala. Xalapa was a Totonac town, and the Spanish were treated well, housed, and fed. A day's march from there was the fortified mountain village Xicomichalco, where Cortes had already ventured to drive out Mexica forces on behalf of Chief Xicomecoatl of Cempoala. Today this town is called Xico Viejo and is a small farming village. The Spanish and Totonac soldiers, as well as the assortment of Taino and Maya men and women who support the convoy, climbed up the narrow stairs to Xicomichalco. Below the village were plentiful farms growing maize and other fruits. Diaz thought he saw a type of grape growing on the trellises here. They camped for a night and were again fed, but Xicomichalco was Mexica territory, and this marked the end of Totonac influence. From here, it was with the consent and decree of Moctezuma that the Spanish were fed and housed. Out of Xicomichalco, the convoy climbed up into the high passes of the Sierra Madre, with altitudes over 8,000 feet. The land was still lush with tall trees and dense greenery, fed by the warm, gray tropical clouds that pushed up from the coastal lowlands. All around them, waterfalls cascaded down the deep ravines, and the air was fat with humidity. Near the tops of the passes, the air turned chill, and howling winds whistled through the Mexican pine and juniper, which grew at higher altitude. The group emerged from the winding footpaths and high passes of the Sierra Madre onto the gentle slope of the extinct volcano, then known as Naupa Tecutepetl, or Cofre de Perote as it's known today. The first town out of the zigzag mountain trails was a fortress town called Ixhuacan, where they were welcomed and fed. It was the last welcome place they'd see for 5 days, and the next phase of the march would bring great hardship. Part 2. Deserts and Valleys. That morning, after prayer, Cortes pulled himself up upon his horse called El Arriero and led the convoy out of Ixhuacan, skirting the ancient volcano. Emerald trees and lush undergrowth soon gave way to rocks, gravel, and hardy pinyon pines, as craggly as the canyons they grew in. The Cortes convoy emerged onto a high desert plateau, and for 4 days the group pushed on despite lacking fresh water and food. All the water they came across was too salty to drink. The lakes were saturated with ancient salt that seeped from the hills, unable to flow away. Howling winds berated them with sandstorms and drove freezing rains and hail at them day and night. The conditions were so harsh that several of the Taino slaves, unaccustomed to and ill-equipped for the cold, died from exposure and malnourishment. They continued to push. At the peak of another pass, the convoy came upon some temples and platforms where there had been neatly stacked many piles of firewood. The men, after days of aching cold, set fires and gathered by the bright orange warmth. But the slave women had no masa to make tortillas, and throats were still dry, and their stomachs were still empty. Spirits were crashing, people were dying. After 4 days in this harsh, saline land, striped by ancient lava flows, Cortes and his weary soldiers descended off the plain down into a valley where they came upon the city of Xocotlan. The flat roofs of the houses and tall towers on the temples, all cut of new stone and covered in white plaster shining brightly, reminded some men of their town of Castilblanco, back home. And so they called the gleaming white town built on the rocky Tecalutla River. The scouts had notified the people of Xocotlan of Cortez's approach, and their chief, Ollantaytambo, was there in the street to greet Cortes. After a celebratory commotion in the streets of Xocotlan, the Spaniards were led through the town, with its numerous towers, the scent of incense and food wafting through the streets. In the main plaza, it was hard to miss the Tzompantli, or skull rack, strung with thousands of human skulls and long bones. They were shown to some dwellings and fed meagerly, Bernal Diaz noted. The men were starving. As meager as the meal was, it was food, and they were grateful. After the men had settled and eaten, Cortes went to speak with Ollantaytambo. Through Aguilar and Marina, Cortes asked Ollantaytambo if he was subject to Moctezuma. The chief began to smile. He looked around the room at his head men, and with a laugh he said, "Who around here is not subject to Moctezuma?" And with that, the men discussed in depth Moctezuma's forces stationed throughout the region, and of the defensive might of Tenochtitlan. The conversation also veered toward Cortez's favorite topics, gold, King Charles, and Christianity. Cortes was gaining a fuller picture of the defensive layout of the capital city and of the wealth and power of Moctezuma. In his typical conversational climax, Cortes shifted to the might of King Charles of Castile, and that a small offering of gold would be enough to secure his protection against Moctezuma. Again, Ollantaytambo laughed gently. "I will not offer you any of our gold without the permission of Moctezuma, nor will I change my allegiance, but you are welcome to stay and regain your strength." Another group arrived from a neighboring valley town, and they came to offer gifts. 4 slave girls, each with a gold necklace of poor quality gold. They also brought cloth and some other gold trinkets and an invitation to visit their town. Cortes agreed to visit their town next, as it was on the way to Tlaxcala anyway. For now, Cortes and his men welcomed the chance to rest in such a nice place. The river that ran through the center of town was clean and fresh, and the people were kind. The Spanish stayed for 4 days, recovering from the harsh desert. Then they set off. Ollantaytambo was asked for and granted the use of 20 of his bravest warriors to Cortes, And with that, he set off with his multicultural force of Totonacs, Maya, Taino, Europeans, and a few Africans. Down the valley a few miles is another hillside town of beautifully built houses. From Xocotlan to Ixtacamachtitlan, the valley was continuously populated, fed by the water of the Tecolutla River. The convoy came around the valley bend and saw the heart of Ixtacamachtitlan. The chief's castle was walled securely and sat spectacularly above the town. The Spanish were welcomed here with more meager gifts of gold and with 2 more women. The chief urged the Spanish to avoid Tlaxcala and stay in Moctezuma's lands. Upon hearing this chief's recommendation, Mameshi and other Totonac leaders were advocating for the path through Tlaxcala, who they insisted were their friends and traditional enemies of Moctezuma. So Cortes sent messengers to seek peaceful passage through Tlaxcala, and for several days there was no word from the messengers. And so Cortes decided to push on to Tlaxcala. Part 3. Battles to Tlaxcala. The wall was tall and thick, made of stone and mortar, and it spanned much of the valley floor. In the center was a gap maybe 20 feet wide that allowed for passage. But an overlap in the 2 sections of the wall would force anyone to pass through a brief alley. They were 6 miles out of Ixtacamachtitlan, and nearing the end of the canyon where it opened onto a great farming plain dominated by Tlaxcala and the Otomi people. Cortes ordered the convoy to stop, and he inspected the wall. Some men banged on the stones with their swords, thinking it was well cemented. Others felt it was well fitted but loose, and many soldiers offered their advice on its purpose, but few knew. Cortes asked Ollantaytam's men about its purpose, and their answer was that it was built by Tlaxcala as a defense against the people and forces of Mexico. It marked Tlaxcala's western border. Perhaps the wall could be manned with slingers, spearmen, and archers who could take advantage of this pinch point to rain projectiles. However, some men pointed out the wall didn't span the entire canyon and could easily be flanked. Sometimes the stone doesn't tell the whole story. It takes the people to make the sense come to life. And sometimes there are strategic military failures too. Whatever it was, the convoy passed through uncontested to the plain beyond. Today there are no documented remnants of this wall, so the answers are gone. The convoy began to shuffle into formation and lurch forward through the gap in the wall toward the plain below. Cortes rode ahead with 5 of their horsemen to scout. The plain before them was painted with agriculture. Spires of smoke from numerous villages rose into the air like lazy dust devils. They spotted a hill in the distance, and Cortes and his men thought it might make a defensible camp for the night. A small group of Otomi scouts was approaching, perhaps 15 or 20. As they neared, they spotted Cortes and the other horsemen. The Otomi scouts huddled and decided it was best to head back and report what they had seen. Although they were armed with small round wooden shields and macuahuitls, or the obsidian-lined clubs common to Mesoamerican infantry, they were not ready to take on 6 Spanish horsemen. The night before, the leader of the Otomi people in Ticoac, who occupied the southeast part of the plain, had received orders from Moctezuma. They were to welcome Cortes and to house and feed his people and horses, and to clean their lodgings. Well, the Otomi chief disagreed and decided to test the Spanish. The Otomi army marched for the mouth of the valley where the Spanish were now descending. Their advanced scouts had run straight into Cortes's horsemen. 2 of Cortes's horsemen rode ahead to detain the men, but this sent them running, so the Spanish horses gave chase. As they closed in on the Otomi scouts, several stopped and turned to face the oncoming charge. The warriors stood firm, raised their obsidian-lined macuahuitls up, and waited for the moment to strike. Like thunder, the armored horses' hooves smashed into the ground, driving them toward the Otomi soldiers with their lances raised. Just as the Spaniards were about to smash the Otomis, they stepped to the side and lunged heavily at the horses' necks. The obsidian-lined blade cut deep into the neck of one of the horses, killing it instantly, its head dangling only by flesh. The rider, Cristobal de Olid, went down with the horse, and the Otomis began to swarm around the fallen horse and rider. The second horse, in an attempt to rescue Olid, was also taken down, but her rider managed to fight free of the Otomi warriors. Cortes and a few other horsemen were close behind and saw what happened. They charged into the fray and were able to pull Olid and the other horsemen away, only slightly wounded. Both horses were dead. This alarmed Cortes greatly as the veneer of infallibility had been broken. The Otomis knew the horses could be killed, but there was little time to ponder the consequences as a battalion of perhaps 4,000 Otomi soldiers emerged from nearby arroyos and gorges. Horns and drums beating, warriors were shouting and whooping. Arrows and stones began to fall on the small Spanish contingent. The horses charged, small skirmishes broke out all over. Spanish steel swords and lances had cut through the Otomis, leaving a dozen dead. A contingent of Spaniards with the main convoy heard the commotion and hurried to their aid. It was a brief but costly encounter for the Otomi men, and seeing reinforcements was enough to end the conflict. The Oz counted 17 dead warriors, but the Otomis had been carrying away the wounded and dead throughout the skirmish. Perhaps 50 or more had been killed. The Spanish, by comparison, counted only 5 severely wounded men, and of course, the 2 horses killed. That night, the Spanish and their Totonac allies slept close to the battlefield near a stream. Getting caught in a hail of darts, stones, and arrows may not be fatal to an armored man, but it sure leaves a lot of cuts and bruises. In that riverbed, the men used the fat of a fallen Otomi man to fill cuts and gashes in the men and horses. A scouting party found some abandoned houses nearby and noticed dogs that seemed to be returning home after the commotion of the battle. These dogs made a fine dinner. Cortes, frustrated at the loss of the 2 horses, drilled the horsemen in the art of charging, again reinforcing discipline. He walked around reminding the men not to break ranks, that these few men were all they had. Cortes expected to be attacked that night and posted guards, and men slept with their weapons and the horses stayed bitted and saddled. But no attack came. By dawn of what some men had marked as September 1st, 1519, the Spanish caravan was up and ready to march. After relieving themselves, eating whatever meager food was left, and saying prayer, they began to move toward the plain, across which was the Tlaxcala Federation. Tlaxcala was a group of 4 communities that had joined together in all efforts, but especially in the effort to resist the men from the Valley of Mexico. As one of the last holdouts against the Triple Alliance, the people of Tlaxcala had expended great human resource at remaining independent of Moctezuma and his forebears. The Spanish pushed into Otomi farmland and began to pillage for food. The Otomi people are yet another distinct cultural group from the Maya, Mexica, and Totonacs. They had their own language and history, including conflict with members of the Triple Alliance. Today, the wider Otomi people, exceeding 650,000 people in Mexico, ranks 5th among indigenous groups. Once word got out about the Spanish pillaging, warriors quickly began to descend on the Spanish surrounding them. The Otomi were taunting the Cempoalan men, calling them traitors for serving the Spanish intruders. More words were hurled back, and soon skirmishes broke out. Cortes called for order and sought the Otomi leaders, but the fighting was out of control, and more warriors were arriving on the scene with every passing minute. Cortes rallied his men into formation, and he called on the royal notary, Diego de Godoy, to record what he witnessed, to preemptively absolve him of guilt in the eyes of the king and lord. Battle spears, arrows, and stones fell on them. Braver warriors swooped in to take a swing, but these men knew the severity of Toledo's steel swords, and that it cut through cotton and wood armor with ease, that it spilled a man's insides on the ground with one slice. The initial barrage of projectiles wounded several men, but they had rallied together and returned with volleys of musket and crossbow fire. Otomi warriors faded back into the cornfields, and there was some quiet after what had been the fiercest fighting of the day. Some men began to shout about going back to the coast. Diaz, on his third expedition to the New World, was content to watch these men gripe. He was intent on wealth and fortune. Cortes charged toward the panicked men and urged them to have faith in God, that he had protected them thus far. It was then the drums, horns, and shouting of the full mixed force of Otomi and Tlaxcala warriors was heard approaching. The Spanish men recalled some 40,000 men in formation marching up the plateau toward them. With no choice now, the Spaniards would need all the divine protection they could summon. Father Olmedo took confession from hundreds of men, convinced of their impending doom. Chaos erupted as both sides fired projectiles at each other. Cortes and the cavalry had been making charges when the Otomi force decided to take a horse down. They massed around a trio of horsemen whose charge had stalled in a large group of warriors. The Otomi grabbed at the horse's reins and mane. They grabbed at the horseman's lance. Pedro de Moron had a good mare, trained for battle. He was a good horseman, but they chose him and succeeded in their mission. Pedro was pulled from the horse, just as an Otomi macuahuitl smashed through the neck of his horse, severing the beast's head entirely. They continued to hack at the horse and Moron, the obsidian tearing at his flesh as the weight of the club drove it into his bones. The other horsemen fought to keep Moron protected, but they were overwhelmed. Eventually, the main force was able to stretch the line around the fallen, half-dead Moron and prevent him from being dragged off. They cut the saddle off the mare and formed ranks again, but the horse was lost to the Otomi, who took pieces for trophies and food. About a dozen men were injured in the rescue of Moron. With the lines formed again, Cortes ordered the cannons fired. The Otomi infantry, brave as they were, had no defensive strategy for the cannons. Lined up in massive formations of hundreds of warriors, the first few cannon shots ripped through many of them and scared many more. The typical Mesoamerican battle was a formal affair with traditions to observe and different goals. While much of the focus of Mesoamerican warfare was on capturing enemy warriors, European battle was far less concerned with life, the goal being utter devastation of the enemy until surrender or complete obliteration. And with cannons, never before seen by indigenous armies, the destructive power of these weapons must have seemed insurmountable. At this point, the Spanish simply hunkered down and slashed at anyone who came near. Cortes ordered his men to conserve their gunpowder and ammo, firing only when needed. After more than 2 hours of skirmishes and projectiles, and dozens of Otomi casualties, the attacks lightened up and the warriors faded back again off the road. The Spanish decided to push for the hill they had spotted, and so, slowly, the caravan moved forward through farms and villages, periodically coming under attack with showers of arrows and rocks from warriors. The soldiers looted what they could as they went. For 2 hours the men fought waves of Otomi as they made their way across the valley to the hill where a tower and a few other stone houses stood. Once the Spanish had taken up position on top of the hill and in the buildings, they were better able to defend themselves. By the end of the day, most of the Otomi warriors had been killed, wounded, or were too exhausted to fight. These brutal skirmishes and battles had been observed by Mexica and Tlaxcala witnesses. The leaders of these places would soon know. Moctezuma in Tenochtitlan, Xicotenga the Elder, and Mashish Katzin in Tlaxcala. The Otomis had thrown everything at the invaders, while only causing trivial damage to the Spanish. Cortes's men counted 15 wounded, including Pedro de Moron, who was severely wounded after taking dozens of blows from obsidian clubs. His horse was also killed. In fact, almost all the horses were wounded. The sun set, and the attacks ceased. Cortes and his men settled in on the hilltop at a place called Tehuacacingo. In an act of vengeant terrorism, Cortes rode out under cover of darkness early the next morning and laid waste to several villages, looting and burning them to the ground. Whatever meager opposition could be mustered to counter these swift and devastating attacks was crushed. At first, their hooves must have felt like an earthquake or thunder rolling across the plain. But as they approached and the thunder grew louder, one could hear the foreign voices shouting commands. Then the screams of their neighbors dragged from their homes were weeping for those who had tried to defend their homes and failed. From village to village, Cortes spread fear, burned homes, set fire to the corn, and stole lives. As dawn began to break that September morning, Cortes and his men, covered in the blood and dust of a dawn spent pillaging, arrived in Zompancinco, the last major town before Tlaxcala, and where Xicotenga had been camped. Wanting to turn toward peace and intending not to scare the villagers, Cortes and his men changed their tempo and walked their horses into the still sleeping town. The men shuffled through the dusty streets, only the clanking of their chest plates and shields betraying their presence. The horses' hooves grazed the soft soil before finding a firm grounding and lifting again into the air as they walked. They stood quietly in a square, waiting to meet the town's elders or whoever might come out. The purple sky brightened, the horses whinnied and scratched their hooves in the dirt. The soldiers squatted or leaned against walls, while in the distance the smoke of destruction and death rose to the skies. From behind a whitewashed clay wall, 2 elder priests quietly presented themselves to the horsemen. Almost crawling, they offered a humble greeting, food, and peace. Cortes thanked them for their kindness. The men made excuses for why they had not come to honor Cortes and his men, and that Captain Xicotenga had ordered them not to share provisions. They sent another man to search for some women to make maize cakes, and 2 women arrived and began to cook. Cortes asked the men to go to Tlaxcala and tell the council that he wanted peace. Cortes went on to demand 20 more tamimes to carry the 40 or so turkeys the people had rustled up for them. After spending the day dealing with messengers and supplies, Cortes and his men, with the tamimes, headed back to the hilltop camp. Part 4. New allies in Tlaxcala. After lurking in the shadows of the Otomi armies and sizing up the Spanish, and after seeing the entire Otomi army crumble into the maze, and after seeing the smoke rising from the pillaged villages Cortes had destroyed, these men of the Tlaxcala Confederation were not keen to lose more soldiers to conflict. Generations of war with the Valley of Mexico had already left their ranks depleted. Like a skinny street dog that refuses to go down, Tlaxcala had resisted for generations. Their choice now could undo that delicate balance. The 4 elders of Tlaxcala included Xicotenga the Elder, leader of the town of Tizatlan. Xicotenga was an elderly man when Cortes arrived on the plain outside of Tlaxcala. His son, Xicotenga the Younger, was an eager captain of the powerful Tlaxcala armies. From Ocotlulco is Maxixcatzin, the second-ranking chief among the Confederacy and a military commander. The other 2 cities that formed the Confederation were Tepectipac and Quiahuitzlan. The chiefs of these 4 towns met in Xicotenga's palace in Tizatlan, with many other elders, priests, and military men. One man told the chamber of the military dominance displayed against the Otomi and mixed Tlaxcala armies they had sent at the Spanish. He recounted the death and carnage of the cannons, their lightning fire smashing through large swaths of men, horribly mangling them. He told that they had barely caused any harm to the Spanish, a few horses, perhaps a man or 2. The people of this valley have thrown our best at them, and now many of our allies are dead, and still these men come. It is time for a new direction that we are best served with peace and an alliance with them. Many others nodded and verbally agreed. The Tlaxcala Confederation had made a decision. Xicotenga, old and blind, spoke. Then send word of our decision to these foreigners. Send a great gift of food and whatever treasure we can spare. And to my son, the army is to stand down, Xicotenga said. He has a great fire in his chest and has lost many men. These orders will not be taken easily. But he must obey. There is to be no more loss of Tlaxcala people. We shall see what these foreigners want. And with that, a group of ambassadors and elders gathered, treasure was collected, food was prepared, and Tlaxcala was to submit to Charles, King of Castile. Captain General Xicotenga the Younger, who was camped just outside Zompancinco, received his orders to stand down and deliver food and a message of peace to Cortes. As predicted by his father, this did not sit well. He had gathered 20,000 warriors for what he saw as the final assault. After having coordinated a tiered, sustained attack on the Spanish with the Otomi, he felt he had them weakened to a point where he could finish them off. The elders did not agree with him, and in the interest of preserving life, they ordered him to stand down. Displeased, angry, and full of vengeance, Xicotenga the Younger found the restraint to march to Cortes's hilltop camp and follow his father's orders. Xicotenga, with about 50 people in his envoy, including Tlaxcala nobles, warriors, and aides, entered the camp. He also brought tamemes bearing food. The Tlaxcalans lit incense and greeted Cortes with great respect. Xicotenga, in his red and white cotton robe, stepped forward and explained to Cortes that they had attacked from fear, that they were fiercely protective of their freedom and had never been subject to anyone, not even Moctezuma or his forebears. He went on to explain that they welcomed him in peace and requested he come to stay in Tizatlan as a guest of his father. Cortes feigned anger and listed many grievances, both legitimate and petty. Ultimately, peace was his goal as well, and he did agree. In Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma, still unwilling to use his military, instead sent another envoy of food, cotton garments, and treasure, this time asking Cortes to name his price for an annual tribute to King Charles. The messengers were to tell Cortes to name an annual fee, and that it would be paid without delay every year. And again, part of his agreement was that Cortes would leave and not come to Tenochtitlan. So the group of 5 nobles and their entourage took the message to Tlaxcala territory, where Cortes was still camped on the hill. Mexica ambassadors witnessed the Spanish-Tlaxcala peace agreement and were greatly upset. In their own negotiations with Cortes, they tried to frame the Tlaxcalans in the same light they saw them, as scrappy scoundrels not to be trusted. The unease of the Mexica ambassadors was like a tell to Cortes. He made it clear he was unconcerned about their issues. They urged Cortes to wait in the camp 6 days before leaving to Tizatlan, to give them time for a response from Moctezuma. And a message was sent to Moctezuma about an emerging peace between their great enemy Tlaxcala and these invaders. From Tlaxcala, a Mexica runner would first pass through Cholula, an ally city to Moctezuma. Cholula was a great religious center and place of pilgrimage. At its center is a massive pyramid dedicated to Quetzalcoatl. Next, the runner would pass south around the volcano Popocatépetl, up along the shores of Lake Chalco and onto the causeway that led to Tenochtitlan, reaching the capital in less than 2 days. Moctezuma had been besieged by reports of the Spanish advance. Messengers, traders, nobles, and soldiers kept a steady live stream of information coming to the palace. Word of the Otomi armies collapsing had already been reported. It seemed nothing he, nor anyone else, did could slow their movement toward his capital. His mind was filled with anxiety. These men pressed on him in a way that felt inevitable. Moctezuma had told Cortes not to come already. This man's persistence was frustrating to the Mexica king. In his heart, for the first time, he felt fear. Moctezuma had hoped that Tlaxcala and the Spanish would chew each other up a bit. Perhaps a weakened Tlaxcala might even emerge victorious, a win for Moctezuma. But the worst news of all had been dispatched from Cortes's hilltop camp. The Mexica runner entered Tenochtitlan from the southern Iztapalapa causeway. He pushed past the tamemes carrying their loads on their backs, supported by head straps. He crossed the wooden bridges and canals. He passed the chinampas where the Tenochcas farmed their corn, melons, beans, and other crops. On his right, he passed a brightly painted temple to the wind god Ehecatl. The great temple began to dominate his view as clusters of houses and sweat lodges and markets filled in the urban landscape. Smoke tinged the air, and the comforting smell of tortillas or tamales cooking sometimes cut through. Emerging onto the plaza of the flyers, the runner could see Moctezuma's palace for the first time on his right. After being blessed with incense, the messenger told Moctezuma that Tlaxcala had allied with Cortes, and that they had offered the full strength of their army to Cortes and Charles, King of Castile. This was like a sledgehammer blow to his stomach, the absolute worst outcome. A seemingly unstoppable, technologically advanced elite force now allied with their historic enemy. Tlaxcala had inflicted almost no damage on the Spanish and now welcomed them into their capital as friends. Were the gods abandoning him? He lamented out loud. Could anyone resist the power of these men? his agony apparent to all in the room. Like an anxiety had grabbed the corners of the palace and twisted, wringing everyone inside with the tension of Moctezuma's heart, and fear began to spread. Part 5. Staying in Tlaxcala. The Spanish were greeted in Tizatlan by Xicotencatl the Elder, Maxixcatzin, and other leaders of the Tlaxcala Alliance. Dancers and priests came out to greet them, bless them, and celebrate peace. Women and children came to gawk, as they had in Cempoala and many other small towns between. They were given the best the people of Tlaxcala could muster, including girls and women that they used for their pleasure, as well as food and treasure. After 2 weeks of relentless fighting and misery, Cortes and his men enjoyed the hospitality offered by Xicotencatl. The men were shown to the best buildings in the palace grounds. Food was provided, and the men settled in, grateful to have something to eat and a safe place to rest. Cortes, however, was not so sure and posted sentries in doorways and high points around their quarters. Soon they were joined by Xicotencatl and his entourage of nobles, wives, and attendants. The elder was indeed an old man, hobbled by age, wrinkled by years in the sun, and his hair thin and gray from the burden of leading the Tlaxcala Confederacy. With his one good eye, he peered out at the blur that was Cortes. Where his body failed him, the old chief's mind was still sharp. He was displeased that his new friend Cortes would post guards, as if harm may come to them. "This is a sign that we are not good friends," the Lord of Tizatlan said. "These are necessary precautions I must take at all times. Please do not be offended," Cortes pleaded. Once the matter of security had been addressed, Cortes wasted no time in discussing God, Mary, Jesus, and the Catholic faith. Having told his speech many times now, he knew where to hit his inflections and which words translated best. Marina similarly translated with rehearsed flair. He explained that King Charles was a great king and could be a powerful protector. He urged them to abandon their gods and take Jesus Christ and his faithful servant King Charles as their protectors. It was not an easy sell, and Xicotencatl pushed back. And again the voice of the friar Juan Diaz whispered to Cortes not to push too hard, that in their time faith will come. And he listened, instead asking to convert one temple for their own Christian altar. The next topic both sides were eager to discuss was Moctezuma and Tenochtitlan. Very quickly, Xicotencatl and his men were downloading mass amounts of intelligence to Cortes and his men. Every military detail they could recall was transmitted to Cortes, from formations and tactics to the weapons they used. They discussed the layout of Tenochtitlan, its fortifications, entrances, and water sources. They were giving Cortes everything he would need to choke the life out of the city. From the moment he heard about the Chapultepec aqueduct, it was held as a strategic chokehold to put the city down for good, a time-honored siege tactic, but only if needed. The Spanish force, their thousands of Cempoalan allies, and a mass of stragglers, messengers, ambassadors, and beggars stayed in Tizatlan for 3 weeks, healing, resting, and conducting business. From the city of Tizatlan and Tlaxcala, Cortes sent a message to Villarrica. He also sent 2 men, Pedro de Alvarado and Bernardino de Tapia, to Tenochtitlan, although they were routed to Texcoco and sent back mostly unharmed. He also sent a man to investigate the volcano Popocatépetl, which had been smoking for days. Almost none of the Europeans had ever seen a live volcano, and it stood out as an ominous and spectacular monument in this foreign land. And Cortes and his men were about to erupt as well. Next time, in episode 6, Cortes, now emboldened with his Tlaxcala and Totonac armies, takes his wrath to the people of Cholula. One of the most violent incidents in all of American history, Cortes strikes fear into the heart of the continent. Thank you so much for listening. Gracias por escuchar. For more Aztec history, visit mexicapodcast.com. Mexica, a history podcast, was researched, written, and produced by Jeremy Lips.